Welcome everybody to the second session of the first day of the conference on carbon pricing organized by Professor Jim Stoddard and colleagues in coordination with the Boston University Pardee Center. And without further ado, I wanted to invite Kate Ricke from the University of California in San Diego to start her presentation on a country level social cost of carbon. And while Kate is bringing up the slides, I just wanted to say that she's a climate change scientist that integrates tools from the physical and social sciences to analyze climate policy problems. And she combines quantitative modeling and large data sets analysis and applied to physical and social systems. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me here today to talk to you about this. So I'm going to talk today mostly about a paper that I published with a few collaborators a few years ago now almost, where we broke down the social cost of carbon, which is a measure of the marginal economic impact of a ton of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere, where we estimated that at the country level for the first time. And just as a preview of the results, this is sort of a map that shows that, spoiler, that we found there's a lot of heterogeneity in how social cost of carbon is distributed among different countries, which of course has implications for climate policy making. Now, social cost of carbon isn't, since this is a carbon pricing meeting, it's not synonymous with a carbon price, but it is relevant to carbon pricing in a system where you're trying to make economically optimal decisions. It should tell you something about what you should be willing to pay to avoid making an emission of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay, because I saw that this is open to the public, I wanted to at least explain what social cost of carbon is, because it's not sort of intuitively obvious from those words what we're even talking about when we say those words. So the social cost of carbon is the economic cost, basically, of a small increase in carbon dioxide emissions today. So it's supposed to be a contemporary emission. Sometimes we estimate it for 2030 or 2050 or something, but it's linked to a particular emission in a particular place and time. And technically, getting into the details a little bit more, what it is the net present value of the additional damages that are associated with basically a pulse release of CO2 into the atmosphere on top of baseline or business as usual climate change pathway. So what you expect to happen if no new climate policies are implemented, basically. And so what it represents for us is the marginal impact of CO2 emissions that cause climate change, right? And so why do people usually care about marginal impacts? Traditionally, the way we think about social cost of carbon is from this sort of social planner framework, where if we have a picture that looks like this one on the left, we know that as if on the x-axis we have temperature increase from climate change, and on the y-axis we have both the costs of avoiding that climate change and the impacts associated with that climate change coming to be, as we get more and more warming, impacts go up, and our understanding of impacts is that they go up at a rate that's more than linear, right? And with costs, you know, it's actually less costly to avoid a higher amount of warming, a little bit of like a 0.1 degree going down from 3 degrees to 2.9 degrees is less expensive than avoiding all climate change altogether, right? Like it's extremely expensive to get zero warming at this point. And then if we take the derivative of these, we get the marginal impacts and the marginal costs. So the cost per amount of warming and the cost and the impact per degree of warming. And under an optimal climate policy framework, you want to sort of match those things, right? You want to aim for a place where your marginal costs and your marginal impacts are equal. Now, why are we thinking about a country level social cost of carbon? Why did we get into this? And the reason for that is that we know that the global optimum is not necessarily going to represent a stable outcome when we're making often these decisions at an enforceable level at the country level, right? And so we know there are actually these strategic incentives that are different at the country level than at the global level. And so we want to know also sort of what the Nash equilibrium is. And the way that costs, marginal costs and impacts look different at the country level is that per degree of warming, domestic impacts are lower because a country is only bearing part of these global impacts. And on the other end, these domestic costs are per degree of warming to avoid are higher, right? Because a country only has control over some fraction of the emissions that are being released into the atmosphere. And so what we see is if you're just a country trying to make decisions about climate policy and assuming that no one else is going to do anything, then you're going to have a lot more warming, right? So why we decided to calculate social cost of carbon at the country level is to think about the strategic game a little bit with some quantitative information, right? So we know that the global outcome, the global optimum might not represent a stable outcome. We think that thinking about this at a country level complements this sort of standard normative framework that we think about social cost of carbon within. And given, especially at the time, and even now, the nationalistic tone in world politics, it's important from a policy perspective to understand the costs at this salient decision-making level. But there's still reasons to calculate social cost of carbon at the country level, even if you're thinking about this from a social planning standpoint. Basically, there's reason to believe, and this is what we found as well, that making estimates of economic damages at a disaggregated level at the country level, and then adding them up, even if what you're interested in is global social cost of carbon, is going to give you a more accurate answer of what social cost of carbon is. And of course, if you're interested in seeing strong like good risk mitigating climate policy come to be, then it's helpful to understand, once you have these things quantified, you can start to think about what kind of constraints, what kind of policy levers you need to put into action in order to nudge that Nash equilibrium towards the global optimum. Okay, so we calculated country level social cost of carbon using this 4-module approach, which is recommended by a report by the National Academies of Sciences that was published a year before our paper. And this is basically the process you need to go through if you want to calculate social cost of carbon. There's 4 steps basically, and the first is a socioeconomic module, where you need to answer the question, how do you think the economy is going to change, even if climate change doesn't happen? So basically, social cost of carbon is something we're considering on top of everything else that's happening in the world. And so you need to know how population is going to change, how technology, governance, these things that are going to influence economic outcomes are expected to change over the coming century or so. So you need to come up with a set of estimates for your baseline conditions. And then you need to think about the Earth system, right? How is the Earth system going to respond to the emissions of carbon dioxide that you expect to see as a result of these socioeconomic scenarios. So in order to do that, you need to understand something about the Earth's carbon cycle. So when I emit CO2, where's that CO2 going to go? How much is going to stay in the atmosphere? How much of it's going to be taken up by the ocean, et cetera. And then you need to understand how those emissions are going to translate into temperature change, precipitation change, all of the things that influence human welfare and economic outcomes. The next step after you've gotten a handle on those things is you need to understand what the economic damages associated with environmental change are. So how is the economy going to respond to changes in the Earth system is the next piece of the puzzle. And for that, you need to do things like estimate economic losses that are caused by warming. And all of the other, in theory, you want the losses associated with all the different aspects of global change resulting from your CO2 emissions. And then the final module, the final step in this calculation is discounting, right? And the issue with climate change and coming up with a single dollar value is that some impacts of climate change happen tomorrow and some of them happen in 100 years. And in order to squish that all into a single number, we need to have some scheme for compressing or in considering how we value losses tomorrow versus losses in 100 years. And we do that through social discounting and definition of time preferences. So for us, we basically, for each of these modules, brought together whatever the best state-of-the-art full uncertainty estimates of each of these different components, each of these different modules looked like. So for the socioeconomic module, we used 5 socioeconomic scenarios, the SSPs, shared socioeconomic pathways, that are commonly used in climate change policy and modeling work. For the Earth system module, we used a bunch of model intercomparison ensembles, including a carbon cycle model ensemble that looks at how different modelers around the world have estimated the carbon cycle response to a release of CO2 into the atmosphere, a pulse release, as well as the coupled model intercomparison project ensemble of climate models from around the world. So we have a lot of uncertainty about how much warming we think is going to occur exactly and what the distribution is going to be in different particular places around the world as CO2 emissions continue to go up. For the damages module, we used something called empirical macroeconomic damage functions based on recent literature, climate econometrics literature, basically. Our baseline preferred specification for a damage function came from this paper by Marshall, Burke, and others in 2015. And then we did some robustness checks with other work. And basically what this work does is tries to estimate how much things like warming are going to hurt the economy in the future by looking at how variation within countries and between countries in how GDP was affected by changes in temperature in different places in the past. And there's pluses and minuses to that approach, which we had to get into a lot actually as we were going through this review process for this paper. And then finally, you have to do this discounting. And for us, conventionally, social cost of carbon is calculated with a fixed discount rate. So very similar to sort of a fixed interest rate if you have your mortgage or something. But sort of best practice understanding is that social cost of carbon shouldn't necessarily be calculated that way. And so for our discounting module, we used Ramsey rule discounting, or basically growth adjusted discounting, where first of all, discounting preferences could work differently for different countries. So countries that whose economies are growing a lot faster than others are going to have different preferences about how they make trade-offs between the near and long-term future. And our discounting module allows for those differences between countries. So this is what our results look like. And basically the first result is that there's a lot of heterogeneity in how social cost of carbon is distributed among different countries. And if you add all those numbers up, this is sort of what the global social cost of carbon that we came up with looked like. And the first takeaway here is that we found a global social cost of carbon. Our central estimate was about $417 per ton of CO2, which is much higher than the sort of standard social cost of carbon estimates at the time. And even now we're around about 10 times higher, right? So this is the estimates that were being used in regulatory impact analysis at the time. This is sort of where an expert elicitation puts social cost of carbon. And we found that it's higher. And that there's a lot of uncertainty. We did a big uncertainty analysis, and you can see the range in global social cost of carbon that we found is huge. So finally, there's this strategic dimension to social cost of carbon, right? And we found that actually the ordering of countries in terms of who's winners and losers from the status quo is actually pretty robust, despite this very large uncertainty in the magnitude of social cost of carbon. So for example, you can see here share of social cost of carbon. These are all the G20 countries, and share of global emissions. And we find that like a country like India is bearing about 20% of the global social cost of carbon in terms of the impacts of climate change, but only emitting around 6% of global emissions. Whereas you've got a country like China that's emitting more than 30% of CO2, but is only bearing about 6% of the global social cost of carbon. So main takeaways here, global and country level social cost of carbon, hugely uncertain according to our estimates, but the median estimate we found is much higher. So we thought the estimates people were using were probably too low, that this robust heterogeneity really reinforces one of the reasons why collective action has been difficult. And nonetheless, one thing that we did find is that the three biggest emitters in the world, China, the US, and India, were also consistently the ones with the highest country level social cost of carbon. So those that have the power to actually do something to reduce climate damages are actually also the ones that have the highest incentive to do that. Okay, thanks. If you're interested, we have a nice website where you can explore this data if you'd like to look through it, and the different country estimates and the uncertainty analysis yourself, right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Right now, I wanted us to proceed. Stephanie Weber is at Yale doing a PhD in environmental economics, and Stephanie's research interests are in energy and environmental economics and empirical industrial organization. So Stephanie.
Thank you for the opportunity to present. So this is joint work with my advisor, Ken Gillingham, and with Martin Auvert, who is at Ghent University. So in general, in the US and around the world, environmental policies are sort of implemented as this patchwork of regulations. There are lots of things that sort of overlap. This is a function of different policies getting implemented by the same jurisdiction, and then also just having sort of multiple overlapping jurisdictions. So the fact that in the US, we have both federal regulations and state regulations tackling the same sets of problems. And then we also know that we actually need multiple policies when we're talking about multiple market failures. So in the context of electric vehicles, which is what this paper is about, we have both the unpriced environmental externalities and innovation market failures that are suppressing the number of electric vehicles that are getting made. So overlapping policies can actually interact, and sometimes that interaction is positive, and sometimes it leads to negative unintended consequences. And we have some sense of when those interactions tend to be additive. So generally, multiple price policies will be additive. Quantity policies will substitute for one another to different extents. And then there's still some ambiguity also around when you have price and quantity policies, when they act as complements or substitutes. So in this paper, we're looking at a very specific setting in which there might be an interaction, specifically between carbon pricing and policies to promote electric vehicles. And here we're being kind of vague about what policies to promote electric vehicles are. We're sort of agnostic about that, but I can talk more about what we actually model. We know in general, carbon pricing is going to reduce average emissions, but what matters for electric vehicles is the marginal emissions, the marginal generator that turns on to charge those electric vehicles. And I think there is less clear-cut evidence about how carbon pricing will affect the marginal generation. So in this paper, we look at this question, this interaction, using first a simple illustrative model that shows how it might be possible for a carbon price to make the emissions of electric vehicles worse. Then we use an empirical analysis to show that that interaction is actually plausible in sort of a reasonable range of carbon prices. And then finally, we explore those dynamics over the longer term using a large model of the US energy system. And we find that actually a moderate carbon price could end up making electric vehicles less environmentally beneficial in many regions of the US. So we're going to start out with this very simple static model of the electricity supply. We have 4 types of generation with different marginal costs. We have the must-take, which is renewables and nuclear, the natural gas combined cycle, coal, and then natural gas peaking plants. So they're all going to have different marginal costs. They're sort of stacked in order of marginal cost, and also different emissions factors, where, as you would expect, coal is the dirtiest. And we're looking at this with an inelastic short-run demand. That's something that we sort of relax in our dynamic model. So when you impose a carbon tax on this system, it is going to increase the marginal cost of generation for each plant by an amount that is proportional to its emissions factor. So when you start out with a low carbon price, it is going to increase the marginal cost of that coal plant by the most. But when we're looking at a low price, ultimately, it's not really making a difference in terms of the order of the stack or what is on the margin. However, once you get to a higher price, the coal is actually now more expensive than some of the previously more expensive natural gas plants. And importantly, coal is now on the margin. So if you add a little bit of demand for electricity, it is going to be charged by a coal plant. And if you are skeptical of the fact that coal can be on the margin, we have done some analyses to look at the ways in which coal is in fact ramping up and down throughout the course of the day that I can show you. And then finally, once you get to a high enough price, you basically make it so expensive that coal can't run. And then we are sort of past the point of turning coal plants on. So as I said, what matters for electric vehicles is what is going to be on the margin. And I just showed that it actually is going to vary by tax level. So sort of revisiting these figures, looking at what is going to be charging these electric vehicles under a low enough price or a high enough price, it's essentially the same thing. We're still charging them on natural gas. But under this mid price, potentially you've gone from charging electric vehicles with natural gas to now charging them with coal, and that's going to be dirtier. And it's going to make electric vehicles look a lot worse. So in the appendix of our paper, we derive the conditions for a carbon tax to make the emissions worse. But we also want to take a look at basically how empirically relevant are those conditions. And so ideally, we would be able to look at a long history of carbon prices and look at how, as carbon price has changed, how that has shifted what is on the margin. Unfortunately, we don't really have that historical variation in the US. And in the regions where we do have carbon prices, namely California and the Northeast, they don't really use a lot of coal, and coal is sort of central to this dynamic. So instead, we use an approach that's based on this Cullen and Manser paper. They have the very smart idea that a carbon price is going to shift the relative marginal costs of coal and natural gas. And so you can use other factors that will affect that ratio as sort of a proxy for a carbon price. And so specifically what they're using and then what we use is the variation in natural gas price that is induced by technological innovation and specifically fracking over the last decade. So we can segment the historical data by an implicit carbon price from that coal to gas ratio and look at what is on the margin under different carbon prices. So the equation that we use is, on the left-hand side, we have the quantity of electricity generated by a given fuel. And then on the right-hand side, we look at how that is changing with different levels of load, controlling for the level of renewables and time fixed effects. And we're looking at a different relationship for on versus off-peak load. And our coefficient of interest here is this beta P, which basically measures as load increases, how does generation from a given source change? So to do this, we use fairly standard data from 4 different regions, PJM, MISO, SPP, and ERCOT. We chose those both because they have good data and because they all have a meaningful share of inframarginal coal. Sorry, I see a chat. And so we get hourly load and hourly net generation from each of those regions. And we also get plant level data from EIA Form 923. We have fuel expenditures and consumption, electricity generation, and then heat rate so that we can calculate the fuel cost at each of these plants. And then we roll that up into a regional fuel cost for both coal and natural gas, and that's the basis for our ratio. And our data covers from January 2014 through December 2019. So just to give you a sense of the variation that we're using, this is the coal to gas price ratio over the full period in each of the different markets. You can see there's quite a bit of variation, and it's not just sort of monotonically increasing. We're not just identifying our effects based on what was true in 2014 versus what's true at the end of 2019, but you actually see it's changing a lot over time. So we are able to basically map different levels of the coal to gas price ratio to an implicit carbon price, and then we split that into 5 quantiles, and we calculate the equation that I showed you earlier at each of those carbon price quantiles for each of the 4 markets. And what you can see is the share of coal that is on the margin that is increasing when load goes up is increasing as the implicit carbon price is increasing in 3 of the 4 markets. The one exception is PJM, and we have some thoughts about why that is the case in PJM. But ultimately, what we care about is not just whether coal is on the margin, but the emissions intensity. So we calculate the marginal emissions at each of these implicit carbon price quantiles. And we also, in addition to doing both on and off peak, we actually calculate sort of weighted based on the different hours that electric vehicles are charging. So we looked at load profiles for electric vehicles, and you see the same general relationship, which is in general, it is increasing with carbon price. The marginal emissions are getting dirtier. So I think that is a useful insight, but we also want to look at over the long term and be able to relax some of our other assumptions. So specifically that inelastic demand, the fact that we're purely looking at marginal changes there, when if we're talking about like a huge uptick in electric vehicle demand, these are potentially non-marginal changes. And then when we look over the long term, we also have the potential of allowing for plant entry and exit, which is an important part of these dynamics. So in order to look at this longer time horizon, we use the National Energy Modeling System, which is produced by EIA. They use it to generate their annual energy outlooks, and then they also do a bunch of policy analysis with it. It's also widely used by academics, not too widely because it is a real pain to set up. So we run our local version of Yale NEMS. It is 13 different modules that cover different parts of the supply and demand in the US, and it goes all the way through 2050. So with NEMS, we run 4 different scenarios. We start with a reference case that's just sort of intended to match the annual energy outlook. Then we run a high electric vehicle demand scenario, which we based on the Bloomberg New Energy Finance projections. It gets up to about 60% of new light duty vehicles are electric by 2040. And I can show you a whole trajectory if people are curious. We also run a number of carbon pricing scenarios, but our central one is sort of intended to be low but politically possible, I guess is how we would frame it. So starting at only $2 a ton and rising to $30 a ton by 2040. And then finally, we run sort of the combined electric vehicle and carbon pricing. And in addition to these central scenarios, we run a number of other carbon prices, which I will show you results from, as well as sensitivities to renewable costs, natural gas availability, and also the exact timing of the increase in electric vehicles. So with those scenarios, we're able to look at basically what the additional generation that comes online to charge electric vehicles is. So on the left here, you can see basically if you start out in the reference case and add electric vehicles, what additional generation do you see? If you start in a carbon price and add electric vehicles, what is the additional generation? And then on the far right, it's the difference between those 2 things. And the main thing here is that in the presence of a carbon price, there's actually this very large increase in generation from coal, which you don't see in the reference case. So if we look at sort of the full time series of coal generation under the different scenarios, you can see that in both of the carbon pricing scenarios, there's a huge drop from the baseline, but there's a large increase relative to just having a carbon price when you add electric vehicles. And that's not something that you see without a carbon price. And when we unpack why that is happening in our results, it's primarily a retirement effect. So the carbon tax would have forced a bunch of coal plants to retire, but the sort of fairly rapid increase in demand for electricity keeps a bunch of coal plants online for longer than they would otherwise stay because it is ultimately cheaper in some of these cases to keep an existing plant online than it is to build new generation. So we're able to translate that into environmental damages. So we calculate the discounted sum of avoided damages relative to our reference case. Each of the 3 rows here are the different scenarios relative to the reference case. And here we also have sort of all of the different carbon prices that we try. So our central case is column 2, but we also have both lower and higher carbon prices. And the main result is this net benefits of adding electric vehicles. And you can see that in our central case, it's negative. But under all of these other prices, if you either have a lower or a higher price, the net benefits of EVs are actually positive. And then we have this other measure that we think is really important as well, which is this idea of net complementarity, which is taking the difference between this number, the benefits of adding EVs to a carbon price, and just the benefits of adding EVs to a baseline scenario. And so if it were positive, that would mean you were getting larger gains from electric vehicles in the presence of a carbon tax than in the absence of a carbon tax. But in fact, even in the scenarios where you're getting benefits from electric vehicles, they're still smaller than they would have been otherwise. We're still basically keeping some amount of coal online that otherwise would have retired. And in our results, in our paper, we show that there's a lot of interesting regional variation in this effect. As you would expect, it's pretty much the most prevalent in the regions that have a lot of inframarginal coal. But we will not talk about that for now. So just to sort of wrap up, we see this as sort of an interesting cautionary tale about the possible surprising interactions between 2 policies that in the discourse are often regarded as complementary. People usually talk about how electric vehicles and a carbon price would work well together. In this case, we actually find that a dispatch and a retirement effect can make it so that electric vehicles are worse in the presence of a carbon price. And we document this effect both using historical data and this prospective dynamic simulation. I think there are a couple of sort of important caveats or context to think about. One is that this is most important in regions with lots of inframarginal coal generation. So if you reached a point where you had already gotten more coal to retire or more coal was closer to the margin, then this would be less relevant. Also, if you get to a high enough carbon price, ultimately the coal is retired and this all becomes moot as well. But we think it's important to note, and we also think that it's likely to be relevant in other settings where electrification is sort of a key policy lever. So that is all that I have. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Robert Kleinberg is a senior fellow at the Boston University's Institute for Sustainable Energy and also a senior research scholar at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. So Robert, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm Robert Kleinberg from the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. Pleasure to be here at the Pardee Center. This has been a fascinating day, really. Every talk has been interesting. As usual, I'm going to be the odd man out. I'm not going to be talking about carbon dioxide, but I am going to be talking about what most people consider the second most important greenhouse gas, which is methane, and in particular, the social cost of methane. So the 15-minute talk is divided into 3 brief sessions. First, to quote our former President George Bush, I'm going to talk about the misunderestimation of methane as a greenhouse gas. Second part is social costs of carbon dioxide versus methane. And finally, I'm going to riff on the old adage that you can't tax what you can't measure. So just to get started, this is work done by others, by Drew Shindell, a climate scientist at Duke University, almost 10 years ago, but the results are still current. On the horizontal axis is years from 2010 to 2070, a 60-year interval. The vertical axis is temperature change since the baseline years of 1890 to 1920 in degrees Celsius. And Shindell calculated 3 different cases. The first is the reference case, sort of business as usual. We continue doing what we're doing. That's the red line. And you can see that temperature continues to increase in more or less a straight line reaching about 3 degrees late in the century. So we don't really want to be there, but that's kind of where we're headed as of now. The second case was a CO2 reduction case as prescribed by the International Energy Agency. That's shown in the blue line. And there, the idea is that you're going to start reducing CO2 in 2012. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but that's the model. You can see that although you've started reducing carbon dioxide in 2012, there is no effect on global average temperature for the first 30 years after initiation of the program. And that is fairly easy to understand. The problem is that there's already a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the atmospheric residence time of carbon dioxide is very long. It's centuries, and there's even a time constant that's millennium. So even if we dead stop carbon dioxide today, it's going to be decades before we start seeing any change. And the 30-year gap from initiation of effort until seeing something now takes us to 2050, which is a date very commonly tossed about in these policy circles. And certainly after this summer, we'd want something to happen before 2050. Now, after 2050, after the 30-year induction time, temperature does start to level off. So that's okay, that's good news, but we don't really want to have to wait 30 years to have some improvement. So therefore, that leaves you with methane. Now, methane is interesting. It's 100 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas on a per ton basis than carbon dioxide, but its atmospheric lifetime is very much shorter. You put methane into the atmosphere today, it's pretty much all gone in about 50 years. And so what you can see from the temperature calculation is that you get a prompt response from, in this case, a 40% reduction of methane emissions. Now that prompt reduction sort of runs out of steam after about 30 years, and the green line becomes parallel to red. So really, in order to have a comprehensive climate mitigation program, you need to control both carbon dioxide and methane. But I'm going to say that kind of they're equally important. If we're concerned about what's going to happen in the near term and far term, we need to be working on both those problems. Now, people have calculated social cost of methane in the same way that they've calculated social cost of carbon dioxide. And Kate described that beautifully, saving me the trouble of going through the integrated assessment models. But the results are shown here on this slide. Just looking at the 3% discount rate, sort of mid-range, you can see that the social cost of methane per emitted ton is very much large at 1,300, is very much larger than the social cost of carbon dioxide. Now, these numbers are from the interagency working group used by the Environmental Protection Agency until 2016. The new numbers are being reworked now. But this is approximately sort of current understanding of these numbers. And so you can see that, they're really, the immediate effect of methane in the atmosphere is fully taken into account in this calculation. So let's just take a common garden variety example, just to put some, just to give us a sense of reality about these numbers. So let's just consider the natural gas that is consumed by the United States in a year. That's about 34 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, of which 96% is methane. Works out to about 650 million metric tons of methane combusted in our power plants and home heating furnaces to make 1.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide at a $45 per ton social cost. That comes out to about $80 billion. That's the social cost of the beneficial use of natural gas in this country. Now, let's think about the lost gas, the methane that's going into the atmosphere for no beneficial purpose, just leaking out of our system from carelessness and suboptimal procedures, in our production and transmission systems. That back in 2018, Alvarez of the Environmental Defense Fund estimated that to be 2.3%. That number now is looking a bit low, but let's just consider it. It's the one that's most widely quoted. That works out to about 15 million metric tons of methane going into the atmosphere. Social cost of methane being $1,300 per ton. That gives us a social cost of wasted methane of $20 billion. So, I mean, this is ironic. I mean, the beneficial use of 34 TCF of natural gas has a social cost of 80 billion, but a pure waste of 2.3% is worth 20 billion, 1/4 as much. So this shows you the dimension of this problem and the urgency of doing something about this wasted gas problem. Now, as I said, there's an old adage, you can't tax what you can't measure. Among an audience of economists, I'm sure that's not a foreign notion. And there are greenhouse gas measurement problems that I divide into easy and hard. A representative easy greenhouse gas measurement situation is shown on the left. There's 2 workers standing on top of a gigantic pile of coal. This could be outside of a coal burning electric power plant. We've been talking about that quite a bit in this session. Now, I can tell you by looking at the size of coal and making measurements and so on, I can tell you how much coal is there. It is known to within a few percent. The carbon dioxide produced in any given coal burning power plant or other industrial situation, given the coal input, the grade of the coal, and the engineering of the plant. So I can tell you to within a few percent, I'm pretty confident that we know the greenhouse gas impact of the beneficial use of not only coal, but all fossil fuels. We know how many barrels of oil, we know how many cubic feet of natural gas we're burning, and we know the efficiencies very well. Those are easy problems. Hard problem is shown on the right. This is a photograph taken by an airplane equipped with an infrared sensor that is methane sensitive, flying over southeast New Mexico a couple of years ago. Just having left the camera on, there was no intention of making measurements, but the aircraft accidentally found this gigantic plume of methane coming from a broken gas gathering pipeline. Now, these pipelines have never been regulated either by the Environmental Protection Agency or the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. So basically, no one knows how long this plume had been spewing methane into the atmosphere at a known rate. The aircraft measures the rate of methane by clever means. But no one knows how long this was going on. But it turns out that when more surveys like this have been done, and there have been quite a few at this point, that this is not an uncommon situation. And because we don't know how many of these there are, and we don't know how big they are, this is what I call a hard greenhouse gas measurement problem. So that 2.3%, there's significant uncertainties. And like I say, that's generally considered sort of a low end estimate. So, one possible solution is, okay, hey, we need to ask our natural gas producers and transmission people how much gas they're losing from their system. Come on, you should know that. And this is an example from Alberta in Canada. They have regulations and procedures very similar to those in the United States, sometimes directly copied, sometimes tweaked. But basically, what's happening here is that in the Lloydminster region in eastern Alberta, the natural gas industry reported methane emissions leaking into the atmosphere corresponding to the green bar on the right. Now, then some academic groups from Canada flew over that same region with methane sensors in aircraft to find out what's really going on. They came up with the red bar, which is 5 times more methane then had been estimated by the producers, who are just basically using spreadsheet methods without a very good certainty of how much they are actually losing. And this is not peculiar to Canada. It's not that the Canadians are particularly lazy or careless. This has been done over and over again in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere. And consistently, aircraft so-called top-down measurements have, and satellite measurements have found anywhere from 2 to 5 and occasionally even 10 times as much methane getting into the atmosphere as the natural gas producers are estimating. This is a huge problem. So what is a possible answer? Well, possible answer is use a lot more airplanes. And that's been going on. So here's a representative example. This is a survey done by the Jet Propulsion Lab, commissioned by the Environmental Defense Fund, over Southeast New Mexico and West Texas, the Permian Basin, which is the nation's largest oil and gas producing region, and possibly in the, well, I think it's in the top 3 or 5 in the world. So this is a huge source of domestic fossil energy. It's also a huge source of domestic methane emissions into the atmosphere. And they flew over 55,000 square kilometers, inspected 72,000 oil and gas producing sites, found 1,100 major methane leaks. Those are the dots. And every dot has been coded according to the methane leak rate and tagged with the owner or operator, because the airplane knows exactly where it is. There's an optical camera going with it. They can figure out exactly where they are and who owns it from public records. And
Robert,
so,
about a couple of minutes.
Yep, I'm just about done. So this is exactly the kind of information you need to have good, robust regulation. And I am fighting right now to try to get that kind of regulation implemented by the Environmental Protection Agency. And then we can figure out how, once we figure out how much methane we have, then we can figure out how to tax it according to the social cost. Anyway, that does conclude my talk. Looking forward to question period and conversation. If you wish to contact me directly, my Boston University email address is shown in red here. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Alessandro, Cocco, and Nahiomy Alvarez from the Chicago Fed.
Thank you so much, Irena. So I'll be presenting, but the research is based on work done with Nahiomy Alvarez, and also would like to thank David Rozovitz, Ketan Patel, Jerome McCauley, and Bea Rivera for their contributions. So I work at the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and I'm responsible for the financial markets group. And I'm here to talk about the role of financial markets in price discovery and allocation of climate change risk. So in the financial markets group, we analyze public policy issues in financial markets and infrastructures, and we look at legal, risk management, technology perspectives. My comments are from a research point of view and not from a supervisory or regulatory point of view. And also, before I go any further, I have to mention that the views expressed here are my own and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago or the Federal Reserve System. So having said that, let's turn to carbon pricing. So one data point is that the CFTC climate change report from the Climate Subcommittee of the Market Risk Advisory Committee was really a relevant step in the evolution of collective thinking on this matter. And the report made a number of recommendations, and recommendation number 1 is that the US should establish a price on carbon. Also, several academic publications identify establishing a price on carbon as a key tool for reducing emissions. And so if we think about the tools that are available to policymakers to implement a price on carbon, then these are a tax on carbon, a cap and trade system, a cap and invest system, and a voluntary market approach. So let's go through these quickly. A tax on carbon, I know that there have been a number of contributions today on this topic. The process of determining a tax on carbon can be complex because of the political ramifications of that. But once policymakers determine the price of carbon, then the process of implementing the tax is relatively straightforward. One potential disadvantage is that taxes are typically unpopular, met with resistance by voters, and that they can be regressive, so that they can affect the lower income communities in a disproportionate manner. And these potentially regressive effects can be counterbalanced by utilizing the revenue generated by a carbon tax in a way that addresses inequalities. Cap and invest is a hybrid, if you will, because the structure of a cap and invest system is based on the establishment of a certain cap on the amount of emissions that are allowed in a given environment. And then the proceeds from the sale of these permits are then reinvested. And so one example is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, Ricke. Ricke is a cooperative of 11 member states in the northeast of the US, and its purpose is to cap and reduce carbon emissions in fossil fuel-fired power plants in each state. So the revenue from the project is reinvested in strategic energy and consumer programs such as energy efficiency, renewable energy, greenhouse gas abatement, and bill assistance. Now, if we turn to cap and trade compliance markets, in a cap and trade approach, the policymaker establishes a cap on the amount of total emissions in a given area, and then corporations who exceed the cap can purchase carbon credits from those who are more energy efficient. And the overall amount of carbon permits can be decreased over time, and that results in an overall decrease in the amount of emissions. We have versions of this approach in Europe, California, and Canada, and China has been working on a national emissions trading scheme for close to a decade, and the scheme was launched earlier this year. And then some of these cap and trade systems are linked to each other. China and the European Commission have entered into a memorandum of understanding to enhance cooperations on emissions trading. And then in some cases, the advantage of linking two systems is that credits in one system can be leveraged in another system. So Switzerland has linked its system, its greenhouse gas emission trading system with the EU, and California's system is linked to the cap and trade system of Quebec. Another alternative is scaling of voluntary markets. So there's an organization called the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Markets that's been very active, very broad private sector initiative. It conducted a number of consultations and issued reports. And the purpose of this task force is to create a large-scale, transparent, and voluntary carbon credit trading market, and that's not linked to a cap and trade system. It's voluntary. So then we looked at the size of these markets. So the current size of the voluntary carbon market is currently estimated at $5.5 billion in 2019, 5.7 in 2020. And McKinsey, who's working in conjunction with the task force, estimates that the market size by the end of this decade could be between 5 and 30 billion at the low end, and more than 50 billion at the high end. So that's a voluntary carbon market, currently about 5.5, growing at the end of the decade to about between 5, 30, or 50 billion. Of course, a very broad range. But what's the size of the compliance market? So the global size of the compliance market as of January 2021 is 227 billion, so much larger than the 5.5 billion of the voluntary market. And it's projected to reach 290 billion by 2030. And Europe constitutes a large majority of this market, with a size of about 277. So of the 277 global size, Europe represents 250 billion. So these are the various mechanisms for establishing a price on carbon, but what should that price be? And again, turning back to the report of the CFTC, the report states the price on carbon should be fair, economy-wide, and effective in reducing emissions in a manner consistent with the Paris Agreement. But we know that there is a very wide range of views about the social cost of carbon. Today, my co-presenter, Katharine, gave us an excellent analysis of what the social cost of carbon means and different views on it. I'd like to just say a couple more words about it. As per the EPA definition, the social cost of carbon is a measure in dollars of the long-term damage done by a ton of carbon emissions in a given year. So estimates in US federal rulemaking about the social cost of carbon range very broadly from about $7 per ton to close to 100, in some cases in excess of 100. Estimates by academics range from between $60 to about $400. So that's quite a broad range. But what about the market? What does the market tell us? So looking at the European market, we've converted euros into dollars at a rate of 1.1. So 1 euro equals 1.19 dollars. The traded price of carbon in the EU has ranged from about $33 per metric ton of CO2 in 2008. Then it went down to about $6 in 2013. It went back up to around $20 to $30 in 2018 to 2020. And then in the course of this year, it's increased very rapidly to $45. So this is the range that we can observe from the largest compliance market in the world. And as we look at this data, then we are now conducting some more research into the role of the financial market. So financial markets perform traditionally a price discovery and a risk allocation function. And so we are going to look at compliance markets in the EU and elsewhere in the world, and looking at whether the market can tell us what the social cost of carbon is, or whether voluntary markets will perform a similar role, and whether we will have a data point, and whether that data point will allow us to arrive at a global price of carbon because of the role of investors by leveraging price differentials in different markets, or whether local differences will result in different prices for carbon emissions in different markets. And thinking again about the way that the financial markets work, then once carbon and other emission credits are established as a tradable commodity, then it's conceivable to foresee that markets will evolve. So typically the evolution is from trading of the underlying commodity to the development of capital market structures such as structured credit, equity, and derivatives trading. And in that context, it will be necessary to establish contract specifications for carbon emissions in a kind of a sharper way than they are established today. And that would be similar to the specifications on a futures contract. We would then look into the role of markets in managing the risk related to climate change. Now, on the question of managing risk, I wanted to mention that in our area, we look at exchange traded products, and for that, those are cleared at clearinghouses. So clearinghouses manage risk by conducting stress testing, and they categorize risks in the terms of historical, hypothetical, and theoretical risks. So historical risks are where past events are replayed today, such as data from the great financial crisis of 07-08. Or hypothetical risks, so we take into account things that have not happened but could happen. And then theoretical risks are statistics or mathematical models that are applied to gauge potential losses. So these are the tools that clearinghouses use to analyze climate change risk. To analyze risk in general, but climate change risk is different from the type of risks that clearinghouses have managed so far. As we know, climate change evolves in a non-linear fashion, so it can be small today, big tomorrow, and then back to small. And also, the future may be very different from the past. You also have incremental increase in the frequency and severity of catastrophic events. So the challenge is whether the tools of the past will be useful in analyzing climate change and predicting climate change, or whether new risk management tools will have to be developed. And we're involved in the debate on developing this tool. We've published a paper on this. It's called The New Framework for Assessing Climate Change Risk in Financial Market, and it's available on chicagofed.org, our website. And in this paper, we establish a new framework for research in the area. And we do that by merging the climate change risk categories of physical risk, transition risk, and liability risk with the risk categories commonly assessed in the financial market. So that's market risk, credit risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk. And just conscious of the time, just to conclude, so different types of climate change risk can cause different kinds of financial risk in addition to causing operational risk, and the impact can be amplified or absorbed depending on the market structure and market regulation. So taken together, these factors affect the overall stability of the financial system. And by focusing on these important questions, we can leverage global markets to begin the process of addressing these climate change risks. That concludes my remarks.